Welcome to this presentation about the biases that we have in making social judgments about others. In spite of the fact that many of us take pride in being good judges of character and being able to size other people up, it turns out that our intuition often leads us astray. And it isn't just a random thing. We're programmed to make certain types of errors in the judgments we make about ourselves and about others. And in this PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to describe some of these biases. First, let's talk about the biases that we have about ourselves. And I'm going to put these all together under the category of self-serving biases, because all of these biases in one way or another function to make us feel special or to make us feel more positive about ourselves. There are a list of these things on the slide, and I'm just going to run down them pretty quickly. But first of all, we have a general self-serving bias. We tend to take more credit for successes than we probably should. We tend to deflect blame for failure onto other people or outside forces probably more than we should. So we explain the things that happen in our day-to-day social life in ways that make us look good. Now, related to this, we have a couple of other things that we experience. One of them is called the spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is what occurs when you think that other people are paying much more attention to you than they actually are. You fuss over how your hair looks, or you remember some embarrassing slip of the tongue that you made, and you go around feeling very embarrassed thinking about how other people are ruminating on that and making judgments about you. The truth of the matter is, most people aren't thinking about you that much at all. And so we overestimate the extent to which other people are paying attention to us and remembering how we look or what we've said. We also have what we call a self-righteous bias. There's a tendency to think of your own opinions, moral values, and so forth as being superior to those of other people. God is on your side, so anybody that disagrees with you on some issue is at best misguided, and at worst they're downright evil. False consensus refers to our tendency to think that our behavior is normal and typical and what most people would do in a given situation. Some funny experiments have demonstrated, however, that no matter what your behavior is like, we tend to think it's more typical than it really is. On the other hand, we also have the capacity for something called false uniqueness. When it serves our purpose, we can see ourselves as having special qualities that make us different from other people, and hence we're not just like everyone else. For example, most people are firmly convinced that they're less prone to self-serving biases than other people, which I think is a nice ironic twist. And finally on this list, unrealistic optimism. We tend to think our future is going to be more positive than the evidence at hand would suggest. Sometimes in my classes I'll ask students to tell me what their GPA was last term and predict what their GPA is going to be this next term. And almost without fail, the predictions are much more rosy for the future compared to the past. In spite of the evidence they have about what their GPA usually is, the expectation is that the GPA is going to be better next term. So that's unrealistic optimism. Just as we have self-serving biases about ourselves, we also have them about our groups. There's something called the ultimate attribution error, which means that we have more positive illusions about the in-group and more negative illusions about outgroups, people who are not part of our group, than we really should. Our in-group is always perceived as being better. Our values and moral judgments are superior to those of other people, and our group is just more desirable, more likable. Outgroup people, on the other hand, are much more likely to be perceived as having lower moral standards, more negative characteristics, and in fact there's something called the outgroup homogeneity effect, where we perceive members of outgroups as being more similar to each other than people in our own group are to each other. And it even gets to the point where, if we're talking about racial groups, for example, members of outgroups actually even look more alike than members of our own group to us. In addition to the self-serving biases I just described, we also have a series of biases that just distort the way we process social information in general. The first of these is so prevalent that it's called the fundamental attribution error. Uh, in a nutshell, what this means is when we're making judgments about the other people, we tend to over-attribute the causes of their behavior to internal things. In other words, we tend to see their behavior as being the result of their personality, their motivations, more than it probably is. We discount the role that external forces and situations play in the behavior of other people. So, we give them more credit than they deserve when things are good, and we give them more blame than they deserve when things are bad. This is related to another bias that we have called the actor-observer effect. Actors and observers tend to give very different explanations for their behavior. Actors are the people engaging in the behavior, and if somebody asks you why you did something, you often will give an explanation that takes into account some of the factors that were influencing you. You might say something like, well, I didn't really have much choice because of this and because of that. I really had to do things a certain way. And so you give much more external explanations for your behavior. Observers, on the other hand, looking at your behavior, will give much more internal explanations, and they'll say things like, well, he just did that because that's the kind of guy he is, or he really wanted that and that's why he did it. And they focus on the internal rather than the external things. One of the reasons why the actor-observer effect occurs is simply because we have different information. If I'm watching somebody do something, my attention is focused on them. And so naturally, when I'm looking for an explanation for their behavior, I'm going to get that explanation from the place where my attention is focused. On the other hand, if somebody asks me about my own behavior, my attention is focused out there in the world and I'm aware of the situation around me, so I'm going to be more likely to incorporate that into my explanation for why the behavior occurred. You can make people give more internal explanations for their behavior by making them more self-aware. Having somebody write a little paragraph about what kind of person they are can lead them to make more internal attributions for their behavior. Or even putting somebody in a room full of mirrors where everywhere they look they see themselves. This makes them more self-aware and they now give more internal explanations for their behaviors. Illusory correlations are essentially seeing what we expect to see. We see relationships when there aren't really any there. And this is a result of something known as a confirmation bias. When we believe that something is true, we actively seek information to support that point of view, and we disregard or don't pay attention to information that contradicts it. So, for example, if you meet somebody who believes that the full moon has effects on human behavior, and that when the moon is full, all kinds of strange things happen and people do weird things and they get into trouble more. They might maintain this belief by paying close attention to situations whenever something weird happens and there happens to be a full moon. They see that and say, aha, I was right. It confirms what I believed, and they see this illusory correlation and it strengthens the belief. On the other hand, they tend to not notice the times when weird things happen and there's no full moon, or when there's a full moon and nothing strange occurs. Those get disregarded and we don't pay very much attention to them. So illusory correlations lead us to see things around us that we expect to see, whether we're accurate or not. Primacy effects refer to our tendency to pay more attention to things that we see first, to weight it more heavily. You all know how embarrassed you are when you make a bad first impression, and you know how difficult it is going to be to undo that first impression, because at some level you're aware of how the primacy effects work. When we meet somebody for the first time, we don't really know anything about them, but we're anxious to put together what we call a schema. We want to understand that person. We want to have a framework of believing we know what this person's intentions are and what their personality is like. So we pay very close attention to the stuff that comes early, And once we form that schema and decide how this person ticks, then the other information that comes in after that is not weighted as heavily. So first impressions really do matter because of primacy effects. Also, in making decisions about what's true and what isn't true, we often fall prey to something called the power of the particular. We're very good at remembering details about individuals, and we like stories or case studies about specific incidents. We're not as good at processing abstract statistical information. So sometimes you will disregard a lot of scientific evidence about something, for example, if you can think of a vivid case study example of something that contradicts that. So, for example, if you read the statistics on smoking leading to lung cancer and heart disease, you might tend to disregard that a bit if you have a relative who's 90 years old and has been smoking 3 packs a day for the last 70 years and they're still alive. That carries much more weight in the judgments we make. Belief perseverance is the tendency to, it's hard for us to change our mind about things. Once we believe things are a certain way or that certain things are true, it takes a mountain of evidence to persuade us otherwise, and we continually reject information that challenges our belief until it becomes completely overwhelming. Impact bias. We're very bad at forecasting how happy or sad something is going to make us. We tend to overweight the importance of things in the present. So I regularly will deal with students who get completely stressed out by a grade that they're going to have in a class, and they think that this is going to ruin their life and that they're never going to be happy again if they don't get that A. And in fact, their future happiness depends upon the grade they get in this course plus everything else that happens in their life. Similarly, when bad things happen, we tend to overestimate their impact as well. And good things don't give us as much happiness as we might think. So we're bad at predicting our future happiness. The overconfidence phenomena. We tend to be more confident than we should be in judgments we make, especially in social situations. The availability heuristic refers to judgments we make about how likely something is. The quicker you can think of an example of something, the more likely you think it is to happen. So for example, if I ask you, what is the probability that you will be attacked by a shark if you go swimming in the ocean? Or what is the probability that you'll be killed in a plane crash if you go traveling by plane? You're likely to overestimate the probability of those things happening because you can think of very vivid examples of times where that did happen. On the other hand, if I ask you, what is the probability you're going to slip in the shower this morning and fall down and die as a result of that, you will dramatically underestimate the likelihood of that happening because you don't know anybody that that's happened to and you think it's very unlikely to happen to you. But in fact, many more people die by slipping in the shower than die from shark attacks or plane crashes. And finally, there's the representativeness heuristic, where you make a judgment about somebody based on how well they match a stereotype that you might have. So if I show you a picture of a group of college students and ask you which one in this group is likely to be the basketball player, if there's a tall African American male there, you might say, well, that's probably the basketball player. Or if I ask you which one of these is the math major, if there's an Asian woman there, you might say, well, that's her. So we make judgments about others based very much on how well they match our stereotypes. So why does this happen? If our minds are shaped by evolution, you would think that they would be designed to make accurate, objective judgments about what's going on around us. And this is certainly true in the kinds of judgments we have to make about the physical world. If we can't tell where the edge of that cliff is, or if we can't tell whether there's a car coming as we try to cross the street, or if we can't tell whether that thing I'm about to pick up is a kitten or a rattlesnake, your genes are going to get removed from the population pretty quickly. There was unrelenting evolutionary pressure to make accurate judgments about the nature of the physical world. However, it turns out that making accurate judgments about the social world may not have been nearly as adaptive. There are certain things our ancestors had to do to be successful, reproductively successful, to survive and to be good at attracting and keeping mates and managing friendships and political alliances and so forth. First of all, we have to be good at remembering details about individuals that we knew personally. We evolved in a world where there really weren't any strangers. You lived in a relatively small tribe of people and you knew everybody face to face, or at least you knew other people who knew them face to face. And there was no real benefit to being able to think abstractly about large numbers of people that you didn't know. So we're programmed to remember specific details about specific people because we needed to be able to detect cheaters and altruists. We have to identify people who we can't trust, people who are going to take advantage of us, and we have to remember that so that they don't swindle us again. On the other hand, it would also be advantageous for us to be able to reliably identify cooperative people who are going to be good interaction partners. And so we're detail oriented in that respect. We have been shaped to recognize these traits and make judgments about them quickly in others. And the self-serving biases work for us because if we don't know that we're lying, we can't undermine ourselves. So if we believe good things about ourselves and about our group and sincerely believe that, we're not going to trip ourselves up compared to somebody who knows they're being deceitful. Optimism, of course, would be very adaptive because you persist. If you believe that good things are going to happen, and if you believe you have the ability to make good things happen, you're going to persist better in the face of stress. Even if you're deluding yourself, you may still be able to outcompete people who are pessimistic and who give up too easily. And we needed to be able to quickly distinguish our in-group from our out-group members. We had to figure out who shared our genes and who did not. And we had to be sort of programmed to remain loyal to the group because being ostracized or driven out of your group in prehistoric times was tantamount to a death sentence. And so when you put all of these things together, it wasn't always going to be to our advantage to perceive the social world in a perfectly objective way. And in fact, having certain biases turned out to have been very advantageous. Now, this doesn't mean that you're necessarily bad at making judgments about people. And in fact, one of the reasons for taking a psychology course is that by becoming aware of the biases that you might be prone to, you can become a more accurate judge of others.